Before dawn broke over the Pacific, the sea shimmered with silver light, calm as if it had never known war. Then suddenly, the furious roar of engines shattered the silence. F-6F Hellcats shot off from the carrier decks, leaving behind trails of smoke smeared across the sky. The massive fleet stirred as one, each ship like a floating city, belching smoke, their shrill horns echoing across the ocean. In the distance, fiery columns erupted from a Japanese warship struck by bombs, the sea churning like the gates of hell flung open. On deck, American sailors rushed to load ammunition, each bomb lifted like a weapon of destiny. Sweat mixed with oil, their eyes gleamed with cold determination. On the horizon, the enemy emerged, Zero fighters diving in desperation, ready to die with their target. The sky became a canvas of chaos, gunfire, explosions, and shards of steel scattering in every direction. And in the heart of the storm, a giant silhouette stood firm, the Essex Class aircraft carrier. Every thunderous landing shook the deck. Every wave of takeoffs crashed against the enemy like a tidal wave. Not just one, but an entire swarm of Essex carriers appeared, turning the Pacific into a battlefield of overwhelming firepower. How could a single class of ship turn the tide of war, crushing Japan's mighty fleet in just a few short years? The answer began at the moment America fell at Pearl Harbor, only to rise again with an industrial might the world had never seen before. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor erupted in flames. In just a few hours, nearly the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships once seen as the backbone of naval power were reduced to charred hulks beneath the waters of Hawaii. To the world, Japan looked like a tiger that they delivered a fatal strike, while America staggered, bleeding and disoriented. Yet from the ashes of Pearl Harbor came a burning question. Without battleships, how would the United States strike back? In early 1942, the Pacific belonged to Japan. Their 6 fleet carriers roamed freely from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the Indian Ocean. Each operation was another dagger driven into the Allies' position. In that moment, the balance of power leaned entirely toward Tokyo. The U.S. Navy had only a handful of aging carriers left, as fragile as small boats in a raging storm. The disadvantage wasn't just in numbers, but in production speed. Japan was ready, while America was still searching for its answer. But that shock jolted Washington awake. Americans realized that the defining battle of the century would not be a duel between massive battleships, but a struggle for the skies. Whoever controlled the air would rule the seas. There was no other choice. The U.S. had to create an entirely new class of aircraft carrier, large enough to unleash overwhelming air power, strong enough to withstand the storm of war. That was the moment the name Essex began to step out of the blueprints. It was not just a ship. It was a direct challenge hurled at the Empire of Japan. From now on, every wave of the Pacific would be the place where American firepower struck back with full vengeance. The first designs for Essex had appeared in 1939, as war in Europe began to boil over. At the time, among the ranks of the U.S. Navy, a few young officers whispered that the age of the battleship was fading into the past. Aircraft, once dismissed as mere auxiliaries, were now capable of carrying armor-piercing bombs, launching torpedoes, and bringing down steel monsters weighing tens of thousands of tons. Yet, no one could have imagined that just 2 years later, Pearl Harbor would prove that grim prediction in blood and fire. After the shock of 1941, what had been only lines on a paper became an urgent order. The U.S. Navy unleashed the full might of the nation's industry to make the Essex project a reality. Shipyards at Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Norfolk thundered day and night. The pounding of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the shriek of red-hot steel being shaped filled the air without pause. Tens of thousands of workers, from seasoned engineers to women stepping into workshops for the first time, shared one mission: to forge a machine of annihilation for the Navy. Technically, Essex was a leap forward. With a standard displacement of over 27,000 tons and more than 31,000 tons fully loaded, she could carry over 90 aircraft, 1.5 times more than many previous carriers. Her flight deck stretched 265 meters, long enough for Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers to take off and land in continuous rhythm, like a living assembly line of ore. Elevators, fuel stores, and bomb magazines were laid out with precision, enabling squadrons to cycle through the air at a terrifying pace. But Essex was more than numbers. She was the embodiment of both ambition and pain. America needed a carrier fast enough, 33 knots, to keep pace with battle and outrun torpedoes. She needed armor thick enough to withstand kamikaze strikes, a steel deck strong enough to be patched and fought from even after being hit. Every plate welded onto her hull carried the memory of Pearl Harbor, a silent vow such tragedy would never be repeated. In Washington offices, admirals like Ernest King and Chester Nimitz looked at the Essex blueprints and saw hope. They knew a handful of ships would not suffice. America needed an entire class, a whole swarm of carriers to flood the Pacific. Only U.S. industry could make that vision real. From 1942 to 1945, more than 20 Essex carriers were launched, each one a colossal piece in the mosaic of victory. If Japan wagered its fate on the suicidal resolve of kamikaze pilots, then America placed its faith in unlimited production. One side fought with blood and willpower, the other with steel and assembly lines. And Essex stood as the clearest answer to the question: how do you turn the tide of war in the Pacific? Under December 1942, the first USS Essex officially joined the fleet. On her deck, the American flag whipped in the cold wind, the deep blare of the horn announcing a new era of naval warfare. The manship ship glided across the dark blue water, not merely as a lone war ship, but as a declaration. America was back. Inside, the crew of more than 3,000 moved with urgent rhythm. From the cooks to the engineers, from the mechanics to the navigators, all of them sensing that they stood at the cutting edge of history. By 1943, Essex set sail, followed closely by her sisters. The New Lexington, the New Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Intrepid. No longer just a few isolated names like at Midway, but a torrent of steel cascading forth. Every few months, another carrier slid down the slipway, lengthening the ranks. On deck, the sight was unlike anything before. Dozens of F-6F Hellcats lined up, engines roaring, the sharp smell of aviation fuel thick in the air, squadrons launching one after another like a giant swarm of bees pouring into the vast sky. Signalmen shouted, flags waved to guide the launches, white contrails curled into spirals against the blue. The entire machine ran like clockwork. Bombs hoisted from the magazines, machine guns test-fired in short bursts, pilots buckling in and nodding for clearance. Every detail was precise, disciplined, relentless. The first campaigns in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands revealed the terrifying power of Essex. In the past, a U.S. carrier entering battle had to tread carefully, always wary of ambush. Now, the Essex fleet could unleash hundreds of sorties in a single day, turning the skies into a furnace. Each time a squadron lifted off, looking down from above, Japanese ships seemed like tiny prey, being hunted. Mitsubishi Zeros clawed upwards to resist, but in this unequal struggle they were cut down in groups, in waves. Sailors on Essex decks looked skyward, watching black trails plunge into the sea, knowing it was the enemy falling from the sky. But Essex brought more than bombs and bullets. It carried with it a sense of invincibility. Even when struck by shrapnel or enemy fire, the flight deck was patched within hours, aircraft once again roaring into the sky. Each wound only seemed to make the ship stronger, reborn as if it had never been scarred. Sailors began to believe they were serving on a ship that could not be sunk, and that belief spread through the fleet like wildfire. For the Japanese, the name Essex quickly became an omen of doom. Wherever this fleet appeared, forward outposts fell one by one. The brief string of triumphs since Pearl Harbor twisted into a lingering nightmare, as the once crippled foe returned with multiplied strength. And this was only the beginning. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific erupted in an air battle unlike anything ever seen. At the Marianas, the Essex fleet led a massive storm of steel. As American pilots launched from the decks, the western horizon darkened with countless black specks, the desperate wave of Japanese planes rushing in. On deck, the signalmen dropped their arms, and squadrons of Hellcats roared forward, lifting into the air and diving headlong into the clash. The Americans gave the encounter a mocking name: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese Zeros rose to fight, but they were no longer the skilled warriors of 1941. Fresh pilots, hastily trained, threw themselves against Hellcats that outmatched them in speed and firepower. In a single day, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The sky transformed into a graveyard of steel. From the decks of the Essex carriers, sailors cheered every time a black plume spiraled into the sea. But behind the laughter was a grim realization. Their enemy had grown so desperate, they were sending an entire generation to die. The Essex fleet did not stop there. It played a decisive role in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. When Japan hurled its entire fleet in a desperate attempt to save the Philippines, the Essex carriers launched thousands of sorties, turning Tokyo's last gamble into ashes. Giant battleships like the Musashi, once the pride of Japan, fell one after another under a storm of bombs and torpedoes. On deck, squadrons were rearmed, refueled, and sent back into the sky again and again, as if each carrier itself were an unstoppable war machine. Amid the chaos of fire and smoke, the view from an American cockpit was suffocating. Pilots screamed into their radios, dodging anti-aircraft fire bursting around them like a deadly rainstorm, then dove to release their bombs on target. Below decks, sailors prayed as they hauled ammunition, knowing that every bomb and bullet they passed forward might decide the battle's outcome. From high above, looking down at the Japanese fleet in flames, the pilots understood. Essex was not just a carrier. It was the backbone of a counteroffensive that was crushing the empire of the rising sun. By the spring of 1945, as the U.S. fleet closed in on Okinawa, the name Essex once again became the eye of the storm. Japan had run out of veteran pilots, but it still clung to one last desperate weapon: kamikaze. The clear blue sky quickly turned into a bloody tragedy. Waves of Zero fighters, bombs strapped beneath their bellies, dove straight at the American decks. Among the prime targets they sought, the Essex Class carriers were always at the top of the list. On the decks, sailors shouted as the alarm howled. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, fire bursts tearing open the sky. Many Zeros were shredded mid-air, but some broke through. One burning kamikaze, a blazing torch of flesh and steel, slammed into the bow of the Bunker Hill. The impact detonated into a fireball that engulfed the flight deck. Hundreds of Americans perished within minutes, the explosion shaking the ship as if the ocean itself was roaring in fury. What made Essex a symbol was not that it was never struck, but that it could endure and rise again after every blow. Even as flames raged, American sailors threw themselves into the inferno, dragging out bodies, dousing fires with bare hands and buckets of water amidst choking smoke, glowing shards of steel. The deck was torn apart, but within hours new steel plates were welded in place. A day later, aircraft were taking off again from the very same deck, a stinging reminder to the enemy that even their sacrifice could not break this fortress. American pilots described the feeling of landing on Essex decks mid-kamikaze fire as if touching down on solid ground in the middle of hell. They knew that every wheel hitting the scorching deck meant one more return from the edge of death. And yet, Essex still stood, immovable, like a stone pillar in the raging current of war. Japanese commanders and soldiers alike came to realize that no matter how many lives they sacrificed, they could never sink the endless swarm of Essex carriers rolling forth. Okinawa became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, but also irrefutable proof. The Essex fleet was the machine that crushed Japan's final hope. From smoke-filled decks, from sorties launched through fire and chaos, America carved a direct path toward the very heart of Tokyo. When the fires of Okinawa faded, the outcome was brutally clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once dominant across the Pacific, was now only a shadow of its former self. Hundreds of warships had been sunk or crippled, including proud giants like Yamato, Musashi, and Zuikaku. The naval air arm, which once haunted Pearl Harbor, had been reduced to sending untrained youths to certain death. The price Japan paid was beyond measure. Over 10,000 lives lost to the sea, and a fleet once hailed as invincible, now lying silent on the ocean floor. For America, the losses were not small. Essex-class carriers were hit by bombs, struck head-on by kamikaze. Hundreds of sailors could perish in a single day. But the difference was this: Essex could be repaired, revived, and sent back into battle. Men fell, but the ship stood tall, and America had the strength to replace the fallen with thousands more men and dozens more ships. On deck, the atmosphere was a strange mixture. Cheers erupted as news of victory arrived, yet sobs choked the air when comrades never returned. For many sailors, Essex was both a home and a grave for their friends. They knew they were witnessing a turning point. From Leyte to the Marianas to Okinawa, each campaign carried the mark of Essex as the hammer blow shattering the empire of the rising sun, strike after strike. In the final days of the war, when B-29s flew from Saipan to drop bombs on Tokyo, when the atomic bomb prepared to end the game, Essex and her sisters were still there, guarding the skies, escorting the fleet. With blood and steel, this class of ships put the final period on Japan's dream of a greater East Asia. The war ended, but the shadow of Essex stretched long across the oceans. It was not just a class of carriers, but a symbol of the harsh truth of the 20th century. Industrial power could decide the fate of an empire. Japan had the spirit of sacrifice, pilots willing to hurl themselves into fire. but they could not bridge the immense gap in production. While Japan built only a handful of new carriers through the war, the United States unleashed more than 20 Essex Class giants, each a floating fortress carrying hundreds of aircraft. For every Japanese ship that sailed, an entire swarm of Essex carriers waited on the horizon. The significance of Essex did not end with World War II. After 1945, many ships continued serving throughout the Cold War, from Korea to Vietnam. They were modernized, fitted to handle jet aircraft, becoming the bridge between the era of propeller-driven war and the age of supersonic flight. This was proof of the U.S. Navy's foresight. They had not built ships just for one war, but laid the foundation for a century of maritime dominance. Looking back, historians agree that Essex was the symbol of reversal. It taught a clear lesson. In modern war, courage is necessary, but not enough. What decides the outcome is the ability to turn an entire nation into a war machine. If Japan had been able to produce carriers at America's pace, would the Pacific War have unfolded the same way we know it today? The Essex Class, those massive ships, not only secured victory but buried Japan's imperial dreams beneath the waves. From flaming decks and sorties launched through smoke and fire, they became proof that wars are not won by willpower alone, but by turning will into steel, into airplanes, into an unstoppable storm. What was once Japan's pride became a graveyard beneath the ocean in only a few short years. War, like a relentless machine, is merciless to both the defeated and the victorious. And now we ask you, if America had not had the Essex, how long would the Pacific War have dragged on? And how different might history have been? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to support the channel with a like, share, and subscribe, so we can continue reliving the most dramatic stories of war together.